The jungle was still dark when the first burst tore through the canopy, not the wild, sweeping fire of panicked soldiers, but something surgical, deliberate, a mechanical heartbeat, thump, 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 5 rounds, 6 at most, then silence. Across the perimeter, hidden among the roots of a banyan tree, Private First Class Takeshi Nakamura pressed his face into the mud. He had heard machine guns before. At Guadalcanal, they had sounded like chaos, long, roaring belts of ammunition sprayed across entire hillsides. But this was different. This machine gun whispered. It spoke in sentences, and with each brief sentence, another Japanese soldier died. Nakamura counted 12 bursts in 3 minutes, 12 separate volleys, 12 separate screams. The Americans had turned the jungle into a killing floor, and they were hunting with precision. For 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Army had fought across the Pacific with the certainty that discipline, spirit, and tactical superiority would overcome material disadvantage. Japanese infantry had been trained in the doctrine of seishin, fighting spirit, the belief that moral force could triumph over industrial might. They had practiced night attacks, bayonet charges, and infiltration tactics designed to unnerve and overwhelm the enemy. In the opening months of the war, these methods had worked. At Guadalcanal, British forces had surrendered despite outnumbering the Japanese. At Bataan, American and Filipino troops had been driven into the sea. The Imperial High Command believed that Western soldiers, soft and individualistic, would crumble under the pressure of Japanese aggression. But by late 1943, in the jungles of Bougainville and across the Solomon Islands, Japanese soldiers were learning a terrible new truth. The Americans had not crumbled, they had adapted, and their adaptation was merciless. The weapon that haunted the Japanese infantrymen was the Browning M1919A4, a belt-fed, air-cooled 30-caliber weapon weighing 31 pounds. On paper, it was an area suppression weapon designed to lay down sustained fire across broad zones, pinning enemy troops and forcing them into cover. Every army had machine guns. The Japanese had the Type 92 heavy machine gun, a reliable weapon fed by metal strips. The Germans had the MG-42, which could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. But the Americans used their machine guns differently. They did not simply fire them, they aimed them. This distinction between firing and aiming was the product of a uniquely American approach to warfare. The United States Marine Corps, in particular, had developed marksmanship standards that bordered on obsession. Marine recruits spent weeks at rifle ranges, learning to shoot not just accurately, but instinctively. They fired from prone positions, kneeling positions, standing positions. They fired at moving targets and static targets. They learned to estimate range, adjust for wind, and compensate for terrain. And when Marines graduated from rifles to machine guns, they brought that same precision with them. The M1919 was not just pointed at the enemy, it was zeroed, calibrated, and employed like a scoped rifle that happened to fire 600 rounds per minute. Marine machine gun teams practiced a technique called precision fire. Instead of hosing down an entire area with continuous bursts, gunners would fire short, controlled volleys, 3 to 7 rounds at individual targets. The traverse and elevation mechanisms could be locked down to specific coordinates. A trained gunner could place rounds through a 6-inch window at 400 yards. More importantly, he could do it again and again, adjusting fire based on tracers and impacts until the target was neutralized. This was not the machine gun tactics of the First World War, where Maxims and Vickers guns were used to sweep no man's land. This was something new. The Americans had turned a crew-served weapon into a precision instrument. Japanese soldiers were not prepared for this. At Guadalcanal, during the battles around Henderson Field in late 1942, Japanese infantry had launched mass night attacks against Marine defensive positions. They expected chaos, close-quarters fighting where Japanese superiority in hand-to-hand combat would prevail. Instead, they ran into interlocking fields of machine gun fire so precise that entire platoons were cut down before reaching the American lines. Marines had pre-registered their machine guns on likely approach routes, setting up final protective fires that created invisible walls of bullets. Japanese soldiers advancing in the darkness would stumble into these kill zones and simply disappear. Survivors later described the experience as running into a threshing machine. There was no cover, no escape, just the methodical thump, thump, thump of Brownings firing in short, measured bursts, each one claiming lives. Corporal James Davis, a machine gunner with the 1st Marine Division, later recalled a night attack on Guadalcanal in October 1942. His position overlooked a ridgeline where Japanese forces were expected to advance. He had spent the afternoon ranging his gun, noting landmarks and distances. When the attack came, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging uphill, screaming banzai. Davis did not panic. He fired in controlled bursts, 5 to 7 rounds, adjusting his aim with each volley. Tracers showed him where the bullets were going. He worked his way across the enemy line methodically, left to right, like mowing a lawn. By dawn, the ridge was covered with bodies. Davis had fired fewer than 400 rounds. He estimated he had killed or wounded 50 men. That was the efficiency of precision fire. Not thousands of rounds wasted, but hundreds of rounds placed exactly where they needed to be. The psychological effect on Japanese soldiers was devastating. The Imperial Army had trained its men to believe that American firepower was indiscriminate and wasteful, that the enemy relied on sheer volume because they lacked skill. But the reality they encountered in the Pacific shattered that belief. American machine gunners did not fire wildly, they fired with purpose. Every burst had a target, every target was hit. Japanese soldiers who survived these engagements returned to their units, describing an enemy that could see in the dark, that knew where every man was hiding, that killed with surgical efficiency. Some believed the Americans had supernatural abilities, others simply stopped believing they could win. The training that produced this level of marksmanship was brutal and unforgiving. Marine machine gunners at Camp Lejeune and Camp Pendleton spent hundreds of hours on the range, learning the weapon's mechanics, its ballistics, its capabilities. They practiced dry firing, adjusting their aiming points by fractions of an inch. They learned to read terrain and predict enemy movement. They memorized range cards and fields of fire, and most importantly, they were taught to conserve ammunition. Every bullet mattered. Not because there was a shortage, American logistics ensured that ammunition was plentiful, but because precision required discipline. A gunner who wasted ammunition on suppressive fire would not develop the skills needed for precision fire. The Marines drilled this into their men until it became second nature. On Bougainville, in the dense jungle terrain around Cape Torokina, this training proved its worth. The jungle negated many of the advantages of conventional warfare. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Artillery was less effective because the canopy absorbed shrapnel. Tanks could not maneuver. It was the kind of environment where Japanese infantry tactics, infiltration, ambush, close assault, should have thrived. But the Marines brought their machine guns into the jungle and turned it into a sniper's paradise. They set up positions with overlapping fields of fire, cleared lanes through the undergrowth, and waited. Japanese patrols moving along trails or through clearings would be engaged at distances of 100 to 300 yards. The gunner would fire a short burst, thump, 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 and the lead man would fall. Another burst, and the second man would drop. The Japanese would scatter, taking cover, trying to locate the source of the fire. But the M1919, with its relatively low muzzle flash and the jungle's natural sound dampening, was difficult to pinpoint. By the time the Japanese organized a response, the Marines had already shifted position or reinforced their line. Lieutenant Masao Hirakawa, an infantry officer with the 6th Division, wrote in his diary about an encounter near the Piva River in November 1943. His platoon had been tasked with probing American positions. They moved through the jungle in single file, weapons ready, expecting to draw fire and then flank the enemy. Instead, they were hit by what Hirakawa described as invisible rifles that never missed. His lead scout was killed instantly, then his second man, then his radio man. Each time a single short burst from somewhere in the trees. Hirakawa ordered his men to take cover and return fire, but they could not see the enemy. They fired blindly into the jungle, wasting ammunition. After 10 minutes, Hirakawa ordered a retreat. He had lost 7 men and had not seen a single American soldier. In his diary, he wrote, "We are not fighting men, we are fighting machines." The symbolic object that came to represent this technological and tactical dominance was not the machine gun itself, but the belt, the long canvas ammunition belt that fed the M1919. American machine gunners carried these belts draped over their shoulders or packed in cans, each one holding 250 rounds. The belts were standardized, mass-produced, and seemingly endless. Japanese soldiers, who often had to ration rifle ammunition and who scavenged battlefields for supplies, were astounded by the sheer volume of ammunition the Americans possessed. After engagements, they would find spent machine gun belts littering the jungle floor, dozens of them, hundreds of brass casings glinting in the dirt. It was not just the precision of American fire that demoralized the Japanese, it was the abundance behind it, the knowledge that the enemy could afford to train every gunner to fire with sniper-like accuracy and still have enough ammunition left over to suppress entire hillsides if necessary. Private Kenji Watanabe, captured on New Georgia in August 1943, was interrogated by American intelligence officers. He told them that Japanese soldiers had been ordered to retrieve spent American ammunition belts because their officers did not believe the reports. How could the enemy fire so much and still have more? Watanabe had personally counted 800 spent casings near a single Marine position. His own unit had been rationed to 60 rounds per rifleman for an entire week. The psychological impact of this disparity was crushing. It meant that every firefight was not just a tactical challenge, but an existential reminder that Japan was fighting a war it could not sustain. The transformation in Japanese tactics began in late 1943 and accelerated through 1944. Unable to counter American machine gun fire through direct assault, Japanese commanders shifted to defensive strategies. They built elaborate bunker systems, dug tunnels, and fortified caves. They avoided open engagements and focused on attrition. But even these tactics could not fully negate the advantage of precision fire. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese forces had prepared one of the most formidable defensive positions in the Pacific. The island's coral ridges were honeycombed with caves and pillboxes, each one mutually supporting. Yet Marine machine gunners adapted again. They used their machine guns to suppress bunker apertures, while other Marines maneuvered forward with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The M1919 could keep a firing slit closed, preventing defenders from shooting, while other Marines closed the distance. It was a deadly choreography of fire and movement, and it required the kind of marksmanship that only years of training could produce.
The doctrine of precision machine gun fire was not just a Marine Corps innovation. The U.S. Army adopted similar techniques, particularly in Europe, where hedgerow fighting in Normandy and forest combat in the Urtgen demanded accuracy over volume. But it was in the Pacific, where resources were limited and every bullet had to count, that the doctrine reached its fullest expression. Marine machine gunners became legendary among both their own ranks and the enemy. Japanese intelligence reports from 1944 specifically warned of American automatic rifle teams that could engage individual soldiers at ranges previously thought impossible for such weapons. The reports recommended avoiding open ground, maintaining dispersion, and never underestimating American firepower. It was an admission that Japanese infantry tactics, honed over decades, had been rendered obsolete by an enemy that had learned to fight with both abundance and precision. The numbers tell the story. At Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division expended approximately 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition in 76 hours of combat. Japanese defenders, dug into reinforced positions, had expected to hold for weeks. They lasted 3 days. On Iwo Jima, in February and March 1945, Marine divisions fired over 10 million rounds of machine gun ammunition. Japanese defenders, tunneled into the volcanic rock, fought with suicidal determination. But even determination could not overcome the sheer weight and accuracy of American fire. A Marine machine gun team, properly positioned and supplied, could keep an entire sector of enemy-held terrain suppressed indefinitely. Japanese soldiers who attempted to maneuver or counterattack were cut down before they could close the distance. But the true genius of the American approach was not just technical, it was cultural. The United States military, and the Marine Corps in particular, fostered a culture of marksmanship that valued individual skill within a collective framework. Every Marine was a rifleman, and every gunner was expected to think like a marksman. This was not an army that relied on mass and attrition. It was a force that combined industrial capacity with individual excellence. The M1919 machine gun, in the hands of a trained Marine, became an extension of that philosophy, a weapon that could deliver overwhelming firepower with surgical precision. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated in the belief that spirit and sacrifice would triumph over materialism, found themselves facing an enemy that possessed both material superiority and technical mastery. The Americans did not just have more guns, they had better trained gunners. They did not just have more ammunition, they used it more effectively. This was the ideological defeat that no amount of satiation could overcome. The Imperial Army had built its doctrine on the idea that willpower could compensate for industrial weakness, but in the jungles of the Pacific, that doctrine met its match in an enemy that refused to choose between quality and quantity. The Americans had both. Years after the war, veterans from both sides would struggle to articulate what had happened in those jungles. Japanese survivors spoke of the terror of facing an invisible enemy that never seemed to miss. American veterans, in turn, described the eerie silence between bursts, the waiting, the calculation, the moment of squeezing the trigger and knowing the bullet would find its mark. The machine gun, which had defined the slaughter of the First World War, had been reimagined. In American hands, it became a precision instrument, a tool of disciplined violence that embodied the industrial efficiency of democratic warfare. The epilogue of this story is not written in the jungles of Bougainville or the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. It is written in the training manuals and marksmanship ranges where the doctrine was born. It is written in the factories that produced 15 million M1919 machine guns during the war, each one built to exacting standards, each one shipped across oceans to men who knew how to use them. And it is written in the broader truth that emerged from the Pacific War, that technological advantage without skill is wasted, and skill without resources is insufficient. The Americans possessed both, and that combination was unstoppable. The jungle is quiet now. The banyan trees have reclaimed the foxholes. Rust consumes the remnants of war. But somewhere in the soil of Bougainville, buried beneath decades of growth, lies a spent ammunition belt, canvas rotted away, brass casings scattered like seeds. And if you listen closely, in the spaces between birdsong and wind, you can almost hear it, the measured, patient rhythm of a machine gun that fired like a rifle. Thump, thump, thump. Precision and power.
discipline, and devastation, the sound of a democracy that learned to fight not with rage, but with ruthless, calculated efficiency. The sound of soldiers who discovered that the machine in the right hands could become an artist's tool, and that discovery changed everything.